Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to each of our witnesses for testifying in Congress today. I also want to thank Mr. Stauber for introducing the ESA Flexibility Act. I'm a proud co-sponsor of this legislation as it allows for greater flexibility while also protecting development and recreational activities when there's no correlation between those activities and the health of a particular species. Too often, unscientific decisions are made in connection with the Endangered Species Act. The obvious case of the long-eared bat was mentioned earlier in Mr. Hagan's testimony, but the reality is that we could go on and on about examples of unscientific decisions being used to hold projects and activities hostage by the ESA regulations. We've also heard from our witnesses today on how providing greater flexibility will benefit project managers, taxpayers, recreationalists, the environment, and the species themselves. Mr. Higgins, in the past, we've heard the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service assert that 4D rules are costly for various reasons, and those reasons always seem to be changing. Can you speak to how you anticipate increased flexibility will save time, money, and resources?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. In Minnesota, and as I stated earlier, the states of Wisconsin and Michigan joined the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources in pursuing this habitat conservation plan. It was an 8-year process. Fish and Wildlife Service had already rightly determined through the process of listing the bat as threatened that habitat was not a problem. So when it came time to make an endangered listing, they didn't have that tool in their toolbox. So all this does is, everyone agrees that habitat in this case was not a problem. It saves the time and money in the 8-year process that the states had to go through. And I appreciate the reluctance of the Fish and Wildlife Service, they're talking about costs in their process, but that work had already been done. It had already been determined. And if there's more cost to the feds, they're shifting it to the states. So cost is cost. And, I also wanted to point out that Mr. von Bismarck talked about, I believe he said something to the effect of, we need to remove all the potential stresses when a species is uplisted from threatened to endangered. And he's right, but we all agree that habitat's not a stress on the northern long-eared bat. There's plenty of habitat in Minnesota. So, yeah, that's the way I kind of see it.
So could you also speak as to why you think increased flexibility is better for the listed species itself?
Well, I did not speak to that, but it's better for the species itself just because anything that streamlines the process, we can get on with the work of creating habitat and making sure habitat is strong. There was a study done, Congressman Stauber mentioned a study from University of Cal at Irvine earlier. There was a similar study done at the University of California at Berkeley 3-4 years ago, and the study found it was related to the fires in the Sierra Nevada mountains, the Sierra Nevada forests out in California, in the California spotted owl. And because there'd been less management in those forests, there had been a lot of canopy lost. And so the study found that there were worse declines in tree canopy in the protected areas than in the non-protected areas where logging and forest management had been performed. So it just streamlines the process. We can get on with the work of making sure habitat is good for these species.
Okay. Director Girton, in your testimony, you said, quote, species listed as endangered are at the highest level of risk and require the greatest protection. Because you seem to acknowledge in your testimony that you have concerns about eliminating some of the differences between endangered and threatened species, I'd like to ask you, do you see the irony in your opposition to this flexibility on the ground, that you believe it destabilizes the differences between endangered and threatened species, while at the same time you are promulgating a blanket rule that tries to eliminate those same regulatory differences?
Congresswoman, a lot of the questions here today center on our belief that we think there is a clear distinction between the level of protection needed for an endangered species, because by definition they're on track toward extinction in the immediate future. And then we have the needs of threatened species, which we have more time to work with them. There's a lot more inherent flexibilities in the Endangered Species Act for them. We at a threatened level can tailor some of the solutions out there, working with partners, give them a lot more flexibility, but We can use a lot of the tools of the ESA for an endangered species as well, including Section 10, Section 7, to promote responsible economic projects to move forward. And we do that every day.
And
Danger
the
doesn't
ESA
shut us down.
Flexibility Act would provide for that flexibility as well, isn't that correct?
We argue with the intent of the legislation, Congresswoman. It comes back to what we believe the original intent of the legislation has a bright red line there, and we're arguing this legislation, in our mind, would do away with that line.
Thank you, and I yield back.